Let's not kid ourselves about what's going on here. The Republican Party has abandoned many of its core principles, things like limited government, things like the stance against judicial activism, all for the express purpose of ensuring that they support policies that enable the party to keep its hold on governmental power. That is, they're embracing policies to stay in power regardless of whether they've been consistent with their core principles. And nowhere is this more evident than in this trend of litigation where we see states, or let's even be more specific, this trend of litigation where Texas has injected itself in the immigration process, an area where the Constitution clearly entrusts this topic to the federal government to act. And yet we have a state government who decides to come in and try to dictate to the federal government what it should do in its area of plenary power. And this is the logical result of a strategy on the part of the Republican Party to use its control over the Senate to install people in judicial positions, people in federal judgeships who have the proper ideological bend to ensure that Republicans are able to maintain their control or maintain their power by pursuing policies that go against individual rights. I am talking very specifically about the recent case out of the Northern District of Texas, which is the state of Texas and the state of Missouri versus President Joe Biden. My name is William Kovatch, and I am a trained immigration lawyer. I've often been disappointed in the way immigration issues are talked about in the media, although it's not always their fault. Immigration law can be a very complex subject, touching upon constitutional issues as well as personal political points of view. My goal is to explain immigration law to you, concentrating on looking at judicial opinions and executive actions in order to explain how immigration law can have an impact on our community and on our country. I hope that you'll join me as we try to make sense of immigration law and how it may affect the average person. This is the latest trend in litigation by the state of Texas to turn the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA, on its head in order to challenge federal government action, not on the basis of due process, but just for the purpose of reweighing all the factors that the federal government takes when it decides to take an action in the area of immigration law, and in particular, to take an action that Republicans are not happy with. The litigation out of Texas addresses the Biden administration decision to terminate a Trump-era policy of remain in Mexico. Now, we've talked a little bit about this on this channel before. I'll have a link to our videos in the description box below. But essentially, the Remain in Mexico program, also known as the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a horrible name because the program has absolutely nothing to do with protecting the migrants who are essentially trying to come to the United States seeking asylum. The Trump administration engaged in a 4-year war on asylum, trying to find new and different ways to prevent people from coming to the United States and making asylum claims. And one of their strategies was to send people who had passed a reasonable fear interview, people who had interviewed with an asylum officer and had convinced the asylum officer that they had a reasonable probability of succeeding on an asylum claim. Well, instead of having them wait for their immigration court date in the United States, the Trump administration just sent them back to Mexico, regardless of whether they came from Mexico, because a number of these people were actually coming from Central American countries, the Northern Triangle region of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But this was done in direct contravention of the law. We have Ninth Circuit precedent that shows how the Migrant Protection Protocols, or the Remain in Mexico program, directly contradicted the statutory scheme that's set up in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Right before leaving office, knowing that their policy was found illegal, the Trump administration concluded a pact with the state of Texas, essentially promising that they were going to make sure to keep this program in effect. This was done 13 days before Joe Biden assumed office. And of course, when the Biden administration assumed office, well, The Biden administration was just completely at opposite ends of the spectrum when it came to a large number of immigration policies that were implemented by Donald Trump and his administration. So Joe Biden issued an executive order to review those policies and determine where those policies ought to be changed. One of the areas where Biden took immediate action was with respect to the Remain in Mexico program, terminating the program prospectively, meaning that people who were coming to the border as of a certain date were no longer going to be sent back to Mexico even after passing the credible fear interview with an asylum officer. Well, Texas didn't like that, so Texas sued under the Administrative Procedures Act. Now we have a decision by a Trump-appointed judge essentially taking Texas's side and telling the Biden administration it has to re-implement the Remain in Mexico program. This decision is crazy on a number of levels. First, let's take a look at what the Administrative Procedure Act was designed to do, what it's meant for. It's meant to ensure that individuals continue to have a say in the way that the government adopts rules and regulations. That is, we had a trend starting in the 20th century where Congress would pass broad programs. In those broad programs, they would set policy goals, but they would leave it to the administration to create the specific rules of how that program operates. The Administrative Procedures Act was passed in order to make sure that there was greater transparency in how these rules were adopted, and to give the public a voice in telling the federal government, well, here's the logic in what you're doing, these are the problems with what you're doing, here's our interest, here's the consequences of the rule that you're proposing to adopt. The prototypical litigation from the APA has been from individuals who have found their rights infringed upon by the way that the government has adopted these rules. But the latest trend in APA litigation has not been by individuals challenging rules issued by the federal government, but by states stepping in as if they were individuals, and not for the purpose of defending due process, not for the purpose of saying, hey, you haven't considered all the individual rights, all the individual views on this, but to force the government to reweigh its options. That is, quite frankly, the Republican Party using the courts as a sword to try to force policies on the government that they could not win, either in the ballot box or because their administration's not in power. Second, one of the hallmarks of APA litigation is when the court finds that an administrative agency has issued a rule without issuing a reasoned opinion. The idea being that before issuing a rule, the government needs to consider alternatives, what's reasonable under the circumstances, what are the policy goals, is this the best way to meet the policy goals? But it's not meant to be a way for the courts to reweigh those decisions. It's meant to be a check on whether or not the government has engaged in a reasoned opinion so that the matter could be remanded back to the government if there are certain aspects of it that don't meet the standard of a reasoned opinion. That's not what the judge did in this case. In this case, the judge completely reweighed all of the evidence to come to the conclusion of this is the better course. This is the policy you should have been considering, and this is the better course. And another thing that's crazy about this is how this federal judge knows nothing about immigration policy. Now, and another thing that's crazy is that in this decision, this federal district judge knows nothing about the operation of immigration law, and that's very evident from the way he describes the process. This, by the way, is not unusual. Federal district court judges do not normally handle immigration cases. Immigration cases are handled by the immigration courts, which is an arm, even though it's called a court, it's an arm of the executive branch. It's in the Department of Justice. Their appeals body is the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is also in the executive branch. It's not a part of the judiciary. Once you've gotten past the Board of Immigration Appeals, in order to get to federal courts, you need to appeal it to a circuit court, which is a federal appeals court. The U.S. District Court is a trial court. The U.S. District trial courts are not set up to address immigration issues. The judges are not required to be experts in immigration law because it's not within their normal purview. And that's very evident because of the way that this judge conflates two different processes under the Immigration and Nationality Act and gives absolutely no attention. I don't even see it mentioned how the Ninth Circuit addressed this very issue and found the Remain in Mexico program to be contrary to that statutory scheme. Specifically, when a person comes to the border and a member of CBP determines that this person is inadmissible, that they don't meet the requirements of being permitted to enter the United States, one of two things can happen. Either, and I'll call this Tract 1, the person is placed in removal proceedings in order to determine whether or not they are admissible. Either the person is placed in removal proceedings so that an immigration court can then determine whether or not this person is admissible, but during this process, the government is specifically permitted to send that person back to a contiguous country. So if they came from Mexico, during this process, they're allowed to send them back to Mexico to await their immigration proceedings. But then there's Tract 2, a situation where a person comes to the border and either they've engaged in fraud or they don't have immigration documents. They don't have a visa or a passport or anything of that sort. In that situation, a person can be summarily deported or summarily removed. This is called expedited removal. A person is removed without any determination by the immigration court on whether their rights have been violated, on whether they meet the criteria of being admissible. No, the immigration authorities, the executive branch, simply has the authority to ship the person back to their home country. But an exception to this second process is when that person makes a claim of fear of persecution or a claim for asylum. Then the statute says that they are to be held in detention. This is a mandatory detention. And there's no provision in that second tract of sending the person back to a contiguous country like Mexico to await the removal process. The statute is very clear that it envisions that this person either remains in detention or that the immigration authorities can release the person on bond. But release the person on bond means releasing into the United States. And the immigration judge in this decision just brushes over the distinction between those two processes, just saying, oh, there are two processes, and oh, by the way, there's authorization in the statute to send a person back to Mexico. No, you haven't even read the law. You haven't even addressed how there are two different processes and two different possible results here. And then the judge goes on for pages on opinions on why the Remain in Mexico program was put into place, how it supposedly is to make the United States safer. And the judge isn't saying that the government hasn't considered these. He's reweighing them. He's saying, no, this is the purpose of the program, and the United States government, you just shouldn't have revoked it. That's not what the APA is designed to do. It's not designed to allow a judge to supplant the logic and the decisions of the administrative agency. It's meant simply to say, hey, administrative agency, you haven't considered all the factors, or you haven't considered the relevant factors here. Plus, what is the state of Texas doing litigating a federal issue? This isn't the state of Texas's area of authority. This is the area of the federal government. This is the state of Texas, one state in a union of 50, essentially trying to dictate to the federal government what its immigration policy should be. And the thing is, this isn't an isolated case. This is a trend. This is by design. This is what the Republican Party has always wanted. It wanted to install as many of these like-minded judges into these positions. You take a look at what happened during the Trump administration when the Republicans had control of the Senate. Mitch McConnell just pushed through judgeship after judgeship after judgeship with very little debate over the merits of the particular judge. And in particular, a lot of these judges were appointed with contrary opinions, with opinions from the American Bar Association, just finding that a good number of them just weren't competent enough to be a judge. But that wasn't the issue. The point for the Republican Party wasn't putting competent people on the bench. The point of the Republican Party was putting people on the bench with the right ideology. And why is that? Why is this all happening? Well, in particular, in the area of immigration law, you have to follow the power. You have to understand that what we've got here is a political party whose entire power base depends on uneducated white people. The people who vote Republican are uneducated white people. And yet, if you look at the demographic trends, uneducated white people are making up a smaller and smaller percentage of the entire population of the United States. In fact, white people in general are predicted to become a minority in the United States that is not less than 50% of the population by about 2048, 2049, depending on the latest analysis by the Census Bureau. The goal, particularly in the area of immigration law for the Republicans, has been to delay that date. Delaying that date by making sure that fewer and fewer non-white people come into the country, become permanent residents, and then eventually become citizens with the right to vote. The whole point of the Republican agenda right now is to preclude non-white people from voting as much as possible. And yes, you can see it because of the way they are pursuing the bogus big lie, the charges of fraud in the 2020 election, which did not happen, and how they're using those charges of fraud in order to adopt more and more restrictive voting laws. But you can also see it in the immigration policy, that the whole point of the Republicans' immigration policy is to ensure fewer and fewer non-white people are being admitted for permanent residency, or are being given a chance to come into the country and eventually lead to citizenship. Another thing that's crazy about this opinion is how the judge just ignores common sense. The Biden administration cited that one of the reasons it ended the Remain in Mexico program is because 44% of the cases that were being adjudicated that were subject to this program were being dismissed based on in absentia decisions, that is, decisions where the respondent didn't show up to court. And there's a clear reason for that. The reason is because the Trump administration and the immigration authorities at the border, they pursued a policy of intentional neglect. That is, a policy of not putting in place procedures to make sure that they could keep track of the people who were placed in the program and make sure that they were brought back into the country for their immigration proceedings. I mean, we have evidence that a woman sitting at the border with a notebook was doing a better job of keeping track of people and their ability to apply for asylum than the U.S. immigration authorities at the border, whose job it is to do this. In fact, the Mexican cartels were doing a better job than the U.S. government of keeping track of who had their hearing at what date and when. And that, by the way, is the biggest problem. That's what's leading to this 44% who are being decided in absentia. It's because the cartels are using this situation as an opportunity to kidnap people and hold them for ransom so that their family would pay off the cartels before releasing them and allowing them to go back to their immigration hearings. But this district judge just says, well, you can't tell me that 44% of people who are being decided in absentia are being dismissed because their claims aren't meritorious. That's not what's going on. They're not being given an opportunity to show whether or not their claims are meritorious. In fact, they've already proven to an immigration officer that there's a high probability that they will win their case. The problem is that they're being prevented from coming back to the United States to present their case, which is by design. I mean, it's incredible, this decision. It's just the judge ticking off a number of Trump administration talking points as to why they adopted the Remain in Mexico program in the first place. I mean, what we have here is a very disturbing trend, a trend of two competing ideologies. Now, I know people have been saying there's not much difference between the Republican and the Democratic Party, but that's really not been true in more recent years. More and more, the Republican Party has been standing for authoritarianism, has been standing for being an exclusionary party, and instead of standing against judicial activism, has actually installed judges in order to make sure that they can use the courts as their sword in their quest to ensure the implementation of their agenda. I mean, seriously, it's a crazy opinion that turns the APA on its head. But it's just the latest opinion in this trend of litigation, and I'm afraid it's something that's going to continue even if Republicans keep losing elections on a federal level. which is another trend that we can talk about at some point, and that is the way that the Republican Party has just perfected the undemocratic aspects of the American political system to enforce their will on the rest of the country. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. If there are any topics you would like me to address in the future, please let me know in the comments below. Now, I don't like talking about this, but I am currently disabled because of complications following cancer surgery. If you're feeling generous, I'll have a link to my PayPal account in the description below. Thank you.